Hey everyone, and how goes it? I'm your instructor, Dr. JJ Shepard, and welcome to CSCE 552 Game Development. In the last lectures, we have been discussing concepts related to game production. Taking an idea for a game, we must first design it before we can develop it. We are going to focus today on the concepts related to taking the idea for a game and then generating a game concept. This process is commonly called game design. Game design is the process of drawing from an idea to create the systems, rules, and outcome that create the core game concept. Creating a game concept is an exercise in communication, or more typically, writing, and shares many of the same principles and practices. Communication is fundamental to all games, and we consider games to be an interactive, expressive form that is capable of demonstrating nearly limitless concepts. It often surprised early developers to know just how much writing is involved in the design process, but we will soon understand why. People need to understand the game to play it. If people cannot understand how the game is played, then they won't play it. Communication is necessary for participation. Developers need to understand the game concept to create it. Developers need to know what game they are creating, and effectively communicating the concept is necessary for this to be successful. Creating a good game concept requires expressing it to others well, which is why writing and game design are similar. The game concept answers the questions who, what, when, why, where, and how. These are the same questions that we seek to answer when writing a story for a book, a TV show, a movie, or even an internet show based on game development. While this has been shown to be a direct line, more accurately, game design is based on iterative design. Iterative design is a circular process that tests results, provides feedback to improve the overall design and functionality. Common iterative game design steps involve creating a prototype from an initial idea. Once we have a prototype, we then play test it and gather feedback. More often than not, our initial idea may have some drawbacks and short-sighted rules. We never notice this as we can be a little too close to our own work, so it is useful to have others try it and provide feedback. Using the feedback, we then start to evaluate if the rules work, if the game is engaging, and especially to identify the problems within the design. From here, we have a decision to make. If our redesign was minimal, non-significant, or even non-existent, then we may finalize it into our game concept. Otherwise, we create a new prototype and start the process once more. Each of these steps will be detailed further in following lectures. We have seen in previous lectures that the role of the game designer is to create the game concept from an idea. This involves creating some documentation in the form of a game design document. This is part of the concept phase of game design. We must create a game concept from an idea in order to create a game. We know our goal is to create this thing called a game. We know that communication is key. However, we now need to answer what exactly is a game. We mentioned before this can be difficult to do, and there are a few questions that immediately come to mind that we should take some time to consider. How would you answer these questions? What is the definition of a game? Can we always define what is and what is not a game by some strict guideline? What must a game have? What are the qualities, feature, criteria that all games must have? In relation to this, what is the difference between a game and a toy? These both seem similar, but what would differentiate these? Do games need stories? Is this one of the fundamental requirements for all games? And could this be considered the difference between toys and games? Looking broader, can games be considered work? Or can games be considered art? This can be very difficult to define, as we must also define what is art and what is work. Finally, what is play and how does it relate? Games and play seem fundamentally linked, but how can we define play? The last question requires more discussion, because we do know that play and games are fundamentally linked. We now need to explore concepts related to play and then return back to games. In a similar exercise, let's consider some questions related to play. What is the definition of play? How would you define the qualities and characteristics of play? How can we determine what is or what isn't play? What are some features that would disqualify it? We know how important games are to culture from a historical perspective, and so we must ask, can play be considered work? And can play be considered art? Also, can play be considered serious? This last question is very interesting, as it implies play could mean more than just a form of entertainment. In fact, it also relates to another question regarding work and art. Bringing it back to games for a moment, what are the similarities and differences between game and play? By extension, are games a subset of play, or could it be the other way around? Let's keep an open mind and start exploring some past works that may help us explain play and then later, games. Play has been explored through many different fields over the years. Behavioral psychology and many domains within the humanities have long since explored the idea of plays and games. One of the most important works in relation to play is Johann Huizinga's work Homo Ludens, originally published in 1938. This work is an exploration of play as being an essential factor in human development and civilization. A key element from this work was defining the play concept. This states that play has 5 characteristics. Play is free and play is freedom. Play is separate from ordinary life. Play is distinct from ordinary life both in location and duration. Play creates order absolute and supreme. Play is connected with no material interest, and no profit can be gained from it. Let's consider how this applies or does not apply to modern games for a moment. This book also explores how the play concept appears in many forms within our civilizations. Many cultural activities and rituals exhibit play activities that are similar to games. In reference to this, the magic circle was first used to describe the separation between reality and place, space, and time. In a quote, "The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc. are all in form and function playgrounds." Furthering this, his work explores the play concept in various topics, such as contests, war, poetry, law, knowing, and philosophy. The latter two relate to the philosophical branch called epistemology, or the philosophy of knowing. There is a lot to be taken from this work, but we must move forward and ask once again, what is a game again? Moving forward a little bit, Huizinga's work was expanded by Roger Caillois in his book Man, Play, and Games, originally published in 1961. He elaborates on how the play concept is related to games. Simplifying this, he furthered Huizinga's play characteristics by stating, Play is free and free of obligations. Play is separate from reality, occupying its own time and space. Play's results are uncertain. Play creates no wealth or gain and ends as it begins. Play is governed by rules and behaviors and must be followed by the players. Play confirms the existence of the player in the imagined realities. Now let's again consider how this applies or does not apply to modern games for a moment. Building on play, KOA then defines two types of play. Paideia, play without rules, where this can be thought of as playing with a toy. Ludus, play with rules, where this has more of the structure of a game. Applying this to games, he mentions that they commonly can be grouped by their primary play forms. He then defined the four play forms. Agon, which are games that are primarily focused on competition, such as soccer or billiards. Aleia are games that are focused on chance, and this would include roulette and lotteries. Mimicry describes when a game's focus is role-playing. He describes instances as children playing pretend, such as being pirates. We can even consider play acting on a stage as being a kind of mimicry. Ilinix describes a game focused on perception disrupting or altering. This word is based on the Greek word for vertigo, and is similar to the exhilarating feeling when riding a roller coaster. The loss of stability is usually the goal of these games, and he mentions the Sufi whirling dervishes and the Central American voladores. KOA asserts that games combine these elements in a multitude of ways. For instance, we can combine aspects of Agon and Aleia when playing pinball. Another interesting instance is when we combine both Aleia and mimicry when we watch games as spectators to create a sense of excitement. We know logically that when we pull for our preferred team or favorite athlete, that our support does not affect their performance. However, we mimic their joy when they succeed or disappointment when they fail. Our feelings are ultimately left to chance, as we do not know if they will succeed or fail, but we feel it either way. While this helps us understand play in games a little better, it does not exactly help us define a game. Let's look at some other views on what defines a game. Moving forward again, in 1970, Clark Apt published the book Serious Games, where he defines a game as having four key elements. Activity. A game is an activity, process, and event. Decision makers are players who are actively making decisions. Objectives. Games have goals. Limiting context are rules that are limited to the scope of the game and structure its activities. Notice that there are some overlap with KOA's definition, and with this one, with some more added. Also, there's going to be further discussion related to serious games later in this course. Later, Bernard Sweets, in his work, The Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia, 1978, he provides one of my favorite quotes in defining a game. Playing a game is a voluntary effort to overcome unnecessary obstacles. Within the work, the main concepts that define a game are an activity. A game is an activity of play. Games are voluntary. Games are freely engaged. Games contain specific state, which means there is a goal to reach. Games contain rules and are a key component to games. Games feature inefficiency. Rules limit behavior, making achieving the goal less efficient and thus creating a challenge. For the game to work, rules are accepted and the player accepts the rules of play. In addition, he also defines illusory attitude, and this is the emotional state that players must have in order to play a game. It requires accepting arbitrary rules even when those rules make the process less efficient. In another great quote that demonstrates this concept, he describes how the game golf requires players to have a illusory attitude. Suppose I make it my purpose to get a small round object into a hole in the ground as efficiently as possible. Placing it in the hole with my hand would be a natural means to adopt. But surely, I would not take a stick with a piece of metal on the end of it, walk 300 or 400 yards from the hole, and then attempt to propel the ball into the hole with the stick. It seems absurd, but these are the rules players voluntarily accept to play the game. Communication is fundamental to all parts of this, and listening is just as important as speaking when communicating. Having a illusory attitude requires the players to listen, understand, and accept the rules of play. Otherwise, the game would not work. Later still, Chris Crawford in his 1984 book, The Art of Computer Game Design, also assists in defining a game. This is an important work, as it's one of the first books to explore computer and video game design. By the time this book was released, the video game industry was a huge booming trend, but had just crashed in 1983. However, video games presented a new way to play, and once again, how a game was defined required an update. He claims that games feature representation. A game is a closed formal system that subjectively represents a subset of reality. Interaction. This allows players to observe the cause and effect relationship and how it changes reality. Conflict. The player is attempting to achieve a goal, and obstacles cause conflict. Safety. Games provide a safe way to experience reality. We see again some commonality with his definitions along with Kiowa and Apt, even despite this work being in video games. Finally, we arrive to one of the most important works in discussing games, the 2003 book, Rules of Play, Game Design Fundamentals by Salen and Zimmer. In the work, a very simple quote helps us understand what we are creating. A game is a system in which players engage in artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. Through the work, there are many concepts presented, but some of the primary ideas are that games are systems, which is a group of interacting, interrelated, or independent elements forming a complex whole. That games must have players who are participants interacting with the system. That games, being artificial, maintains a boundary with real life. That games feature conflict, a contest of powers which may involve competition and/or cooperation. The game contains rules which defines what players can and cannot do. That games have a quantifiable outcome, which determines if a player has won or lost, and distinguishes games from a lesser play activity. All of this seems to encapsulate what was presented before, and augments it in a way that any game, whether video game or physical game, can be designed in a similar way. We understand that games have these qualities in some way. Better understanding this work, they group together concepts related to designing a game. They do this in a way by using schema. A schema is a representation of a plan, theory, in the form of an outline or model. This is an interesting word that appears in many fields, such as philosophy, as discussed by both Plato and Aristotle, related to the theory of forms. It also appears in psychology in reference to Jean Piaget, who used it to describe the mental development of a child to an adult. We also hear this concept frequently when discussing computer databases. We organize data into tables, which have properties and other attributes. We use this structure to organize our data so that we can look up related information quickly. In this same way, we use schemata, the plural of schema, to organize and frame knowledge. This helps us create a reduced description of important aspects of an object or event. This is important as there are many independent concepts that need organized within an overall outline. When it comes to games, they break this into three main schema called rules, play, and culture. We can simply understand that we may define a game as rules within the space of play, and play is within the scope of culture. For this course, we're only going to focus on play and rules schema. While these help us frame our knowledge, it is not a formula for creating or even designing a game. However, all of this should be considered when formalizing the ideas into the overall game concept. Let's start from the inside and begin discussing rules. Rules is a formal primary schema that focuses on the intrinsic logic and mathematical structures of games. They are the inner, formal structure of all games, and one of the defining qualities of all games. Rules are not the experience of play. Changing the names of chess pieces does not change the game. We consider rules governing the play of the game. Generally, game rules limit the player's actions. Sometimes what the player cannot do is far more important than what they can do. Like Bernard Sweets had mentioned, it is about overcoming unnecessary obstacles. The rules are explicit and unambiguous. Confusing rules can make terrible games. Communication is important and key to all of this. The rules are shared by all players. All players are aware of the rules and how they apply. This is true even if some rules are role-dependent, like being a banker in Monopoly or being a bard in Dungeons & Dragons. Rules are fixed. Rules from the beginning are the rules by the end, even if the rule is changing the rules, like in the card game Flux. Game rules are binding and are repeatable. Games should be able to be played again and again. These are common traits that are not shared by all games. In reference to rules, there are three rule categories: constitutive rules, operational rules, and implicit rules. Operational rules are the rules of play that the players follow. This directs the player's behavior, and this limits the play of the player. Typically, these are found in the game's instructions or rulebook. Setup, turn sequence, and win-loss conditions are common operational rules. Constitutive rules are the abstract core mathematical rules of a game. This contains the game logic, such as how many points is destroying an asteroid, and must be added to the overall score. This does not indicate how the player should enact the rules. It is up to the player to understand these so that they may form a strategy. Implicit rules are the unwritten rules of behavior and etiquette that is generally unstated. One way to view this is to not be rude or inconsiderate of others. Don't be a munchkin, unless you're playing Munchkin. We understand games are systems. More specifically, systems are a set of interconnected items working together as a complex whole. For us, a system establishes and organizes the game processes. Games are a system, and games feature procedures, or in other words, processes that function together as a part of a whole experience. Systems can be classified on how it changes over time, and this leads to system categories. Fixed means the system is constant, thus never changes. Periodic indicates that change is predictable based on a known set frequency. Chaotic is when change is completely unpredictable and everything happens randomly. Finally, complex systems are somewhat predictable and somewhat unpredictable, somewhat periodic and somewhat chaotic. Games are, or strive to be, complex systems, and games have complexity that is directly related to its set of rules. Games that lack complexity lack meaningful play and are not engaging or fun. However, games that are complex systems allow for a much greater space of possibility, which supports meaningful play. This means that a game that is a complex system can be played multiple times and multiple different ways. Counterintuitive as it seems, more rules does not always mean more complexity. This ultimately makes the game difficult to understand and play. On the contrary, complex possibilities are the results of a simple rule set. Simple rules do not tell the player how to interact with the system, but rather provide them the tools for playing within the system. In relation, emergence is a phenomena of which systems generate unpredictable patterns of complexity from a limited set of rules. If a game is an emergent system, then it has a space of possibility large enough to reward players for exploring possible ways to play. In a strange way, this makes game design a second-order design problem. We consider that the game designers create the rules directly. Then, players' experience is created indirectly. Games strive to be complex emergent systems. When considering rules, we want to find that balance between too predictable and too chaotic. Listening to feedback from your playtesters can be invaluable in testing emergence. Within the rules schema and related to systems, we have the concept of uncertainty. Uncertainty can be introduced in the rules in order to keep the game from being too periodic or predictable. Uncertainty is a key component to every game. When a game is completely predictable, it lacks meaningful play. Chance and probability play a big role in creating complex systems. Certain outcomes are completely predetermined. Risk is an outcome with a known probability. Uncertain outcomes are completely unknown. Most games combine some degree of risk and uncertainty. We ideally need to create rules with some level of uncertainty so the game is more complex and less periodic. However, we cannot make it completely uncertain or else it will be chaotic. Rules heavily relate to the information within the game. Information is the knowledge or content that is acquired, manipulated, hidden, and revealed during play. We remember that when we process raw data, it becomes information. Perfect information is when all the players publicly share all knowledge in the game. Imperfect information is when some information is hidden from some or all players. 4 types of information include known to all the players, such as a heads-up display in the fighting game Street Fighter II showing both players' health. Known to one player, such as who is the mafiosi in the game Mafia or who are the imposters in the video game Among Us. Known by the game, such as who is the murderer in Clue. Generated randomly, such as Spelunky, where levels are created procedurally. Information economy is the information that's value is invested from its relationship to other units. By acquiring, hiding, changing, and revealing information, we can create a more complex system where there is space for many strategies to reach the goal. Having a strong information economy leads to players creating inventive strategies and thus having more emergence in the system. We can think of any information as a resource, like money, mana, health, units, experience points, or time as being a part of this economy. We can see this with the nature of risk and reward relating to uncertainty with classically competitive games like chess or Street Fighter 2. In chess, a player may need to sacrifice a piece or unit like a pawn in order to capture a more expensive or valuable piece like a queen or a rook. In a similar way, in games like Street Fighter 2, you may pay a minimal amount of health by blocking and waiting so that you may inflict a considerable amount of damage when the opportunity presents itself. The preferred strategies are up to the player's preferred playstyles. When rules are created, they are expected to limit the player's actions, and in this way, conflict is created. Conflict is an intrinsic element of every game, and it is a dramatic element that emotionally compels us to keep trying to succeed. Rules must guide and limit conflict in the game. Conflict occurs when players struggle to achieve a goal. We define the adversarial elements in the rules, which typically prevent a player from immediately achieving their goal. All games are competitive, where players struggle against each other and/or players struggle against the game system. All games are cooperative, where systemic cooperation means that the players follow the rules and cooperate with the system. In addition, player cooperation is when players are working together within the game space to achieve the same goal. The goal has been defined, and achieving it is based on the rules set forth. Thereby, victory and loss conditions are a result from conflict. Having a level playing field means that every player has an equal chance of winning. Rules that balance conflict can be important, but there are many games that create imbalances in the conflict for a variety of reasons. We write rules to guide conflict and give meaning through the victory and loss conditions. We know that the rules have to be programmed in a video game. Video game rules are related to the program code, game code, but are not the same as the code itself. Rules are abstract that lead to the formal structure of a game, but it does not necessarily manifest into the game code. Constitutive rules handle the underlying game events, the internal events or updates, and are implemented in the game code. Operational rules handle the external events or updates, such as game input. Implicit rules are similar between the digital and their non-digital counterparts. The concept of events are directly related to the game loop pattern discussed later. Now that we have discussed the concepts related to rules, we focus on the ideas about play. However, we must keep in mind that we are designing the rules of the game that guide the play. Rules are within the scope of play when discussing games, and so these concepts must be considered alongside of the rule concepts. Play is an experimental primary schema that emphasizes the player's interaction with the games and other players. They further describe play as freedom of movement within a rigid structure. We keep in mind that this applies to more than just games. They point out the concept of play within a steering wheel of a car. A steering wheel may be able to move a little bit without affecting the tires. This is considered the play of the wheels. Turning our attention back to games, this schema focuses on the human experience and interactions. Gameplay describes the interactions that occur when the player follows the rules of the game. Ludic activities describe the non-game behaviors where participants are playing. Being playful is the state of being in a playful state of mind, or illusory state as mentioned before. Play is experienced through participation. Experience of this can be abstracted as input, the player performs an action. Output, the system presents information to the player. Internal processes, when the player makes decisions. A core mechanic describes an essential action that the player performs in the play of the game. A core mechanic is repeated over and over to create a larger experience and can be a single activity or a collection. While we are discussing play, we have to mention that the rules are what creates the core mechanics within the game. Pleasure is intrinsic to games. In other words, games should be engaging and ideally fun. We play games because we want to get something out of them, like enjoyment or even frustrations. Flow is the exhilarating pleasure that occurs when someone is engaging with an activity and feels control over their actions. This concept was created by Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. In order for this to occur, the following prerequisites of flow must be met. Flow comes from a challenging activity where there are clear goals and clear feedback while exhibiting the paradox of having control amidst uncertainty. The effects of flow are merging of actions with awareness, pure concentration, the loss of self-consciousness, and the transformation of time. I believe we can all relate to a game or even some other activity that we become so engaged that we get lost in them. Related to this concept, conditioning is the acquisition of learned behaviors or skills through reward and punishment. This is studied in behavioral theory and psychology as described by Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. Reinforcement schedules is the rate that players receive reward and punishment. Fixed means that they are at the same time interval. Variable is at different time intervals and may be more impactful to the player. Challenge shapes the player's experience and should be balanced. For instance, anxiety happens when challenge is greater than skills, while boredom occurs when challenge is less than skills. The flow channel is the area between anxiety and boredom. The feeling of flow can be related to a complex emergent system. We create rules in this way so we can experience flow through its play. While games are considered fun or at least engaging, games are much more. Games are considered narrative play, and we're going to notice a lot of crossover between creating narratives and creating games, as they are both fundamentally about communication. Narratives are composed of situation, a series of events that change over time. Character, a narrative that is conveyed through a system of representation. Form, representation is constituted by patterns and representation. Embedded narrative structures are pre-generated components such as video clips or scripted scenes. Emergent narrative structures are created by the player through their own interactions with the game. Players talk about their great successes or failures when playing a game. This triumph or failures emerge from the games we play. Games combine both embedded and emergent narrative structures. Narratives communicate, and the narrative can help contextualize the rules and justify the play. This can be related to the dramatic elements or the elements that emotionally affect us. In further discussing this, goals structure the narrative play by making the player's plans and decisions understandable. It needs to make sense to the player, or else they do not feel motivated. Conflict can be tied to narrative conflicts for dramatic effect. As mentioned, this is related to the emotional effects of a game. uncertainty is linked to the unknown outcome of a narrative. Core mechanics is considered a narrative activity and can create game stories by having the players perform narrative acts. The actions that they are performing should make sense within the context of the game, or else the player is taken out of the experience. This feeling was called ludonarrative dissonance from game developer Clint Hocking in the defense of the game BioShock. The simple idea is that it is difficult to ignore when actions that you are performing in the game does not make sense within the story. This creates an uneasy and confusing feeling that overrides any flow that we may have been experiencing. Space. The narrative space or location which can drastically impact the narrative. We can see how many of these concepts relate back to concepts presented in the rule schema. Narrative is an important role in games, whether we are participating in a story or creating our own. The implementation of narratives within games have some key concepts. Narrative descriptors is any component in a game system of representation. Fictive worlds are larger frames that contain the game's world narrative. Story events are the individual moments of narrative play generated as the game progresses. Both fictive worlds and story events are interrelated. Games are narrative systems, where the narrative experience of a player arises from the game. Like all complex systems, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Story and games share common elements. For instance, if we look at story narrative elements, we can notice that many of these relate back to games. Plot, characters, setting, conflict, point of view, style, and theme. Story structure describes how the narrative elements are unified and structured. A few common concepts and structures are beginning, middle, and end, the three-act structure, and the hero's journey. Cutscenes are common storytelling techniques used in digital games, which cuts away from the action to provide information. This defines fictive worlds, provides story exposition, and fulfills a number of gameplay functions. Non-player characters or NPCs are storytelling mechanics used during gameplay. These are characters within the fictive world which contain dialogue, provide additional exposition, and mission objectives and guidance. Finally, within the play schema, we have the concepts of simulations. Simulations are procedural representations of aspects of reality. All simulations are not games, but all games are simulations. Game simulations act metaphorically, which simulate conflict may take one or more forms. Territorial conflict, economic conflict, conflict over knowledge. Simulations are abstract, numerical limited, and systemic. Understanding various considerations in the rule and play schema all serve a way to start designing a game concept from an initial idea. Yet, all of these were high-level concepts that did not explain how to put it together. Moving slightly forward in our literature review, we now discuss Tracy Fullerton's work, Game Design Workshop, a play-centric approach to creating innovative games, 2004. In this work, she provides a quote that we will use to define a game. A game is a closed formal system that engages the player in structured conflict and resolves its uncertainty in an unequal outcome. From that quote, we can derive that the game's formal elements are players' objectives, procedures, rules, resources, conflict, boundaries, and outcome. These were all mentioned before in some way by previous authors. In addition, games also contain dramatic elements. This is the way that a game emotionally engages a player. Some dramatic elements for games include challenge and play. Both of these are fundamentally required for all games, and we keep in mind that these concepts were part of the play schema. In addition, characters, premise, and story act as additional supporting elements that can emotionally engage a player. Not all games need characters or a story, but it can be useful to make the play more meaningful for the player. These relate to the narrative aspects of play mentioned within that schema. This work focuses on creating games and concentrates primarily on play. To do this well, she mentions that game design works best if it is an iterative process. Iterative design is a circular process that implements a prototype design, tests the results, and finally provides feedback to improve the overall game design and functionality. We're going to explore the iterative process of game design in the next lectures. For now at least, we know what a game is by going through an extensive literature review. There are many concepts related to game design, and I strongly recommend reading articles, books related to all of this. With all of that being said, start considering how you would define a game, and I'll talk to you soon. Time for a bonus round! What was Huizinga's 5 play characteristics? Play is free and play is freedom. Play is separate from ordinary life. Play is distinct from ordinary life, both in location and duration. Play creates order, absolute and supreme. Play is connected with no material interest and no profit can be gained from it. What was Kiowa's 4 play forms? Agon, competition. Alea, chance. Mimicry, role-playing. Ilanix, perception disrupting or altering. What is schema, and what are the 3 schemata for games? A schema is a representation of a plan or theory in the form of an outline or model. For games, it is rules, play, and culture. What are the operational rules, constitutive rules, and implicit rules? Operational rules are the rules of play that the players follow. Constitutive rules are the abstract core mathematical rules of a game. Implicit rules are the unwritten rules of behavior and etiquette that is generally unstated. What are the 4 kinds of systems? Fixed is a system that is constant, thus never changes. Periodic is a system where the change is predictable based on a known frequency. Chaotic means the system changes completely and unpredictably. A complex system is somewhat predictable and somewhat unpredictable, somewhat periodic and somewhat chaotic. What is emergence? Emergence is the phenomena of when systems generate unpredictable patterns of complexity from a limited set of rules. What is flow? Flow is the exhilarating pleasure that occurs when someone is engaged with an activity and feels control of their actions. Now it's time to look ahead with our forward vector. We're going to look at how these topics discussed relate to course assignments. Within the game design document, there is a gameplay and mechanics section, which describes the rules and the core mechanics that will be implemented in the game. For the game's rules, identify the constitutive and operational rules. Determine if the game system is complex and will create emergence within the play. Ensure that there is a level of uncertainty to create a complex system, but not so much that it creates a chaotic system. Establish the kinds of information and how it will be created as a resource economy. Consider how the rules create conflict for the player. In addition, consider how the game will be played by identifying its core mechanics via the player's interactions. Think about the experience of flow and how to best balance the challenge versus the player's abilities. Identify the narrative components within the game, and consider what the game will simulate. With all that being said, I'll talk to you next time.